it wasn't in the script. So I got there, and he came to my dressing room one day, and he knocked on the door, and he said, we're going to do this montage. She said, well, really, it's not, well, let me tell you about it. It's, this, and we're on the floor of the forest, and in the pond, and everything, and we're naked. I went, oh, my parents are not going to like that.
Donna Mills was just 29 when she got the call that would change everything. A supporting role opposite Clint Eastwood in his first directorial feature, the 1971 psychological thriller Play Misty for Me. At the time, she was still relatively unknown outside of daytime television. Eastwood, already a major star, was taking a career gamble by stepping behind the camera for the first time and inviting Mills to join him for one of the film's most intimate and vulnerable scenes, a fully nude sequence that she would later admit left her more anxious than anything she had shot before. More than 50 years later, Mills speaks about that moment, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of reflective clarity, grateful for the trust Eastwood offered her, candid about the fear she had to navigate, and honest about the power dynamics of being a young actress on a male-led set during a very different era in Hollywood. The unexpected beginning. What Mills remembers most clearly is how unglamorous the beginning actually was. She wasn't sent a script through agents or courted with champagne. She was simply invited to Carmel, where Eastwood was personally walking actresses through the energy and mood he envisioned for his first film as a director. What struck her wasn't bravado, but restraint. Eastwood was already one of the most famous men in America, yet instead of selling her on marquee scale, he talked about tone, realism, shadow, and the way jazz, fog, and psychological intimacy would carry more tension than blood or spectacle. Mills later admitted she said yes before she completely understood what she was agreeing to, only that she instantly trusted him. It wasn't until she returned home and actually read the script that the nude sequence registered in full. Suddenly, it wasn't just an exciting job, it was a career dilemma. She was a young actress from more conservative television roots. She knew nudity could lock her into a certain perception for years, but she also knew what it meant that Clint Eastwood was directing his first film and that he wanted her. As she would later put it, it wasn't an exploitation situation, it was a gamble, but a respectful one. And she suspected even then that very few actresses would ever be offered a role like that, not because it was nude, but because it was layered. Quote, I really had to think about it, she later told the Clint Eastwood archive, recalling her state of mind the night she got home with the script. But I felt that Clint was going to do it very tastefully. I didn't think he'd make it tawdry or anything. That distinction mattered. Even before shooting began, Mills could sense that Eastwood was approaching nudity not as something to flaunt, but as a psychological shift, a burst of disarming vulnerability in a film where nearly everything else is guarded, withheld, or weaponized. She decided to move forward, not because the nudity was easy, but because the context behind it was deeply considered. On location in Monterey, the crew was small, almost shockingly intimate for a studio-backed thriller. There was no circus atmosphere, no boom of shouted instructions. Eastwood, already famous for instinctual minimalism, carried that same energy into directing. Mills later said she never once felt rushed or performed at. He spoke quietly, rarely hovered, and cared more about whether she emotionally believed the moment than how it would look in publicity stills. The nude sequence was scheduled early, perhaps to avoid looming anxiety, and she remembers that he cleared the set down to essential personnel without ever making a show of it. What surprised her most wasn't just the care, but the silence. Eastwood didn't rehearse it theatrically, didn't choreograph it for titillation. He let the camera absorb what felt real and let her decide what she was willing to reveal. That degree of agency, especially in 1971, wasn't routine, and Mills noticed. It made her want to match the seriousness of his restraint, not shy away from it. Decades later, she still doesn't describe that day as comfortable, only as dignified. Quote, he made it very easy for me, she said in a retrospective conversation. He's such a gentleman, and there was never any sense of pressure. It was like we both understood what it was supposed to be without having to talk it to death. Trust, more than anything else, shaped the outcome. The scene was brief, haunting, rather than salacious, and its lasting effect had little to do with what was shown and everything to do with what it implied. That was precisely Eastwood's aesthetic: emotional danger over graphic spectacle, silence over flourish. Mills walked away not feeling exposed, but initiated, as if she'd crossed a threshold into a different level of cinematic seriousness. It wouldn't become her defining role, but it would change the tone of offers that came next. What's often forgotten now is how radical Play Misty for Me was in 1971. Strewn between languid romance and outright terror, it blurred genres in a way that felt disorienting to studios at the time. Erotic, but also mournful, with jazz performance and Northern California melancholia woven into its bones. For Mills, acting in it wasn't just risky, it was artistically unusual. Everything about Eastwood's direction said he was aiming at something more European: psychological tension, moral ambiguity, sensuality without commentary. And that mattered to Donna Mills, who sensed early on that her career could easily slide into predictability if she wasn't fiercely deliberate. Accepting a risky role where she was seen as more than blonde ornamentation was a step towards longevity, not away from it. It aligned with the instincts that would later fuel her best work, including Knots Landing, where she reinvented the soap archetype into something sharper, icier, and disarmingly intelligent. Misty became proof that she could lead with calculation, not caution. Quote, "I knew it might shock some people at the time," she once confessed years later, "but I also knew I would have regretted it more if I let fear make that decision for me." A turning point in her own self-perception. Filming that sequence, brief as it was, reshaped the way Mills saw herself professionally. Until Misty, she had often been cast in roles that felt reactive rather than centered. Women who existed to complete someone else's energy rather than carry a perspective of their own. With Eastwood, she wasn't a supporting decorative element. She was part of a psychological equation that changed something internally. She would later note that this was the first time she felt like she was contributing to the emotional temperature of a film, not just reacting to a male lead's temperature. The nudity wasn't frivolous, it was part of the psychological exposure. And when the scene wrapped, she realized she had crossed a personal boundary in the most controlled way possible, not eroding her sense of agency, but strengthening it. Far from destabilizing her, the experience made her feel more grounded, more in command of her future choices. Her colleagues noticed it too. When Misty released, many casting directors saw Mills differently, not just as a graceful presence, but as someone willing to take a daring role if it came with substance. Suddenly, doors she'd barely been invited to knock on a year earlier began opening. The reaction. When the movie finally premiered, the response to Mills was sharply divided and deeply telling. Some critics dismissed her performance as too soft, ignoring the quiet precision she brought to the brief but pivotal romantic shift in the film. Others praised her nuance, recognizing that she anchored Eastwood's character emotionally before Jessica Walter's storm arrived. But what Mills remembers was how wildly people interpreted the nude moment as if they were seeing entirely different scenes. Some framed it as conventionally erotic, others as startlingly intimate. What almost no one seemed to understand was how disciplined and controlled it had been. And perhaps that was the point. The audience believed what Eastwood wanted them to believe, that intimacy could be unsettling, ambiguous, even prophetic. What mattered more to Mills was she didn't feel exploited. She hadn't left the set questioning herself. If anything, she was surprised at how quietly the film held its power, without commentary, without justification. It wasn't trying to explain her character or sensationalize her, it simply let her exist. Now it's time to hear from you. Did Donna Mills' experience with Clint Eastwood change the way you think about vulnerability and agency in early Hollywood filmmaking? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.